Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Chris Love! That was me introducing myself. That's what Zen masters do, you know. We need a big round of applause. So, welcome. This is When Tableau Breaks. Throughout my career, 5.5 years using Tableau at the Information Lab, I've broke Tableau a lot. So today we're going to break some Tableau. We're going to see then whether we can fix it together. We might not, who knows. The great thing about doing a demo about when Tableau breaks is that most of the time I'm trying not to break Tableau during demos. Today, you won't know when I'm breaking Tableau deliberately and when I'm not. So I get to get away with lots of stuff. I'm going to be just here because all the session is going to be in Tableau. So apologies for hiding from you, but let's get on with things. So the first thing to say is I'm going to do a Q&A at the end. So get your favorite kind of Tableau breaks kind of questions if you want to ask me anything about how Tableau works or how Tableau breaks, then that will be the time at the end of the session. Now, the learning curve in Tableau, you perhaps feel like you've got this, you're that little stick character crawling up that hill, trying to get to the top of this mountain learning Tableau. I've got bad news for you. It doesn't get any better. You know, this is where you probably are. You know, I'm perhaps one peak further on my journey with Tableau. And it's a constant struggle. You're always learning new things, always breaking things. I don't think I'd be ever ashamed of breaking Tableau. It's part of the learning process. You know, I do it every single day. So the first thing I want to do is get us all on the same page in terms of some definitions, some basics of Tableau. It's the real learning pieces that you need to put together in order to learn Tableau. Dimensions and measures. These are the things that drive Tableau. But very few people, or perhaps too many people, can explain how they work and what they do, and the difference between those discrete variables and categorical and continuous variables. So let me show you my explanation of how this works. By the way, I'm going to be publishing all this content on Tableau Public at the end of the session, everything we build out together. So I really want you to take away this content and what I'm talking about and take it back to your place of work and your community members where you are and try and deliver this session to them. Sit in a meeting room and go through some of the things I'm talking about. And I think it will help you. It will help you reinforce what I'm doing, but it will also obviously help your colleagues, and those who haven't had the chance to see the session will get a chance to learn that. So let's dive in and start talking about the difference between these measures and dimensions. First of all, measures tend to be green pills. They tend to be continuous. So let's drop up this sum of sales. That's a green pill. It defaults to that because it's a measure. And when I do that, a green pill creates an axis. A green pill will always create an axis in Tableau. We know it's an axis because if we right-click on it, we get an edit axis. If we then drag on something like state onto rows, then we get what are called labels. Labels are what happens when you drag a blue pill onto Tableau. They break out the view. So we've had our view at just here, broken out by each state, and the axis is then just showing the bars, because that's the best way of Tableau. Tableau knows to build that. If I then drag on something else, like segment, Tableau is going to break that down into panes. The state forms the first pane, and then you get a bunch of labels for the segment. Likewise, I can drag something like region up here, and that will break out my columns into different regions. And again, I get now 3 axes because the label breaks out that view into panes, and then we get an axis per pane. So now I want to talk about aggregate and non-aggregate variables and how they work in Tableau. This is a pretty fundamental part of how Tableau works. Let's delete profit ratio. And I'm going to drag on subcategory. And then let's look at sales. And what often happens when people are using Tableau, and the first way I find that Tableau breaks for people, it often happens when you've got a few more columns on. Perhaps you're trying to build a table in Tableau, and you might have customer name and things like this. You might want to have the shipping date, so I'm going to drag that with the right mouse button and put on a discrete pill. So you're trying to build up this table to show how data works. And then someone will say, okay, now I want to include sales in this table. So they'll pick up this sales pill and they'll drag it across. And they'll drop it just here. And then Tableau comes up with this loading view layout. And people say, well, that's not what I wanted. Tableau's suddenly broken for me. And I see people doing this all the time. And that's because we dragged a green pill on. We dragged a green pill on and we've got an axis. The axis breaks out the view for every single one of these. So bottom left-hand corner, 9,258 different labels. And that's not what we wanted. So to avoid that and to avoid that loading time, I'd always recommend just picking up the sales, dropping them down here onto detail, changing them to a discrete pill, and then continuing that journey up. And that's just going to save you a little bit of time. It's going to save that loading error, and it's going to, particularly in demos and things, it's going to save you having that kind of Tableau's broken moment. Let's go back. And I'm going to drop sales on text. Let's make that a bit bigger. And I'm also going to drop profit over here as well. No, let's not do that. So Tableau's broken. Tableau's decided that because I had something on text, it's given me a color now because I've dropped a pill onto this show me area. So when I did that, what Tableau was doing, it comes up with that show me dialog. Show me. And Tableau's going to decide the best way of displaying that information. And that's not what I wanted to see. So instead, I'd like to see the sales as a pill. So let's do this. Drop this down here, turn it into a discrete value, and then put it on there. Right. So we've got profit just here, and we've got sales just here. And now, I'd like to calculate the profit ratio. Again, what a lot of people do when they're first using Tableau is try and build this out like you would Excel. So they'll right-click, create a calculated field. They'll call it profit ratio. And then they'll take the profit and divide it by sales. And let's put that up here. Turn it discrete and just drop it into here so we can see what's happening. And Tableau has calculated a very weird profit ratio. I'd expect 33,000 divided by 163,000 to be less than 1. Tableau's given me 72. Tableau's not showing me what I expected to see as a beginner using Tableau. And that's because I'm using it like Excel. Tableau doesn't work like Excel. If we look at the pill up here, Tableau is doing the sum of that profit ratio. That sum tells me that Tableau is doing an aggregate variable. We can change that aggregation, so we can make it average. It'll make the numbers lower, but it doesn't give the right answer for what we want to do. Because what's happening is Tableau is creating that calculation for profit ratio, and it's doing it at the row level. So for every single row in my data, it's calculating that profit divided by sales. And then when I drag it into the view up here, it's doing an aggregation on that to get it at the level of subcategory. So for every subcategory, it's now averaging all those rows in our data that are profit divided by sales. And that's why it's really important to know what level your data is at when you bring it into Tableau. So this data is Superstore sales, and we need to be aware that that's not one row per order. This is one row per part of an order that's fulfilled. And that's really important when we come to decide at what level our calculations should do. And you need to be aware when you're working with your data, and particularly when you break into the ways that Tableau is going to break, you need to be aware of what a row means in your data set. So how do we fix this? Well, we need to turn Tableau into building an aggregate variable. So we need to sum our profit. We're summing the profit just here, so this is what we're looking to do. And we need to sum our sales. So we've got a valid calculation. We're doing sum of profit divided by sum of sales. And now if I click OK, Tableau's broken again. What does this mean? We've got this red pill. And it's telling us that the calculation average profit ratio can't be used to a user-defined aggregate. What does that mean? A user-defined aggregate is, it's now saying that we've defined our aggregation within that calculation. We're summing profit, we're dividing it by the sum of sales. So our calculation is now at the level of the data within our view, which is the subcategory level. Therefore, we can't average that value because we've already aggregated it within our view. So to get around this particular error, what we need to do is just pick up our profit ratio and replace it. And what you'll notice as I drag that on is that we've got AGG to tell us that it's an aggregate that's happening within the view. We're not applying a secondary aggregation to that. So let's do that. I'm going to make that discrete, and then we can just replace that pill. So now we've got that proper profit ratio that's working within our view. Calculating things at the row level would be applicable for something like sales divided by quantity, for the cost per item in an order. But it's not applicable when we're doing things like the profit ratio at the subcategory level. So it's really important to work out in your calculations, where do you want that calculation to happen? Do you want it to happen at the row level, or do you want it to happen in aggregate when you're in your view? Okay, so that's kind of the basics out the way. That's got us all onto the same page as how Tableau works. So I've got a few examples. Let me just move this. There we go. So our first example is we've been given the task of highlighting important sales by region. And we want to color the chart if the sales in a region are over 50,000 for that subcategory. And if they're not, we want to color them a neutral color. So how do we do that? Well, we create a calculated field. I've got one prepared earlier here. And let's start. So we want our highlighter calculated field that we're going to put on color to say if the sum of sales, because we want to work on these aggregated bars, and these are the sum of sales. So if the sum of sales are greater than 50,000, then we want to color it by what it's already colored by, which is the region pill. So it's just a different color per region. Else, we want to color it using something neutral. So I'm going to use the word none. And let's end that. And we've got an error. Tableau's telling me I've done something wrong. We get the red squiggle of doom. And we can hover over that, or we can look down here and find out what's going on. So Tableau says we cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate comparisons or results in if expressions. Who's seen this error, cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate expressions? It should be everybody, I expect. Yeah, lots of hands going up. Who just drags around and tries to fix it and eventually ends up getting somewhere? Yeah, I've been there. I've done that. So what Tableau's telling us with this error is that we've got two different types of calculation in our error, in our calculated field. We've got the sum of sales, which is an aggregate that's defined by the level that our view is at. In this case, the sum of sales is defined by the combination of accessories and central, and we're summing up all those rows of sales in order to find that value. Our region isn't aggregated at the moment. Our region is purely that row level calculation. That's a non-aggregate. Therefore, Tableau's struggling to mix them together. He's trying to put something in the view just here, which is region, and doesn't know how to do that. Because we haven't told it how to move the row level item into that higher level aggregation. So we've got to do something. Region is already in our view though. Region is in the column level. So for every one of these regions, all these bars just here correspond to central. So we can aggregate up that region by using something like the minimum of the region. The minimum of the region across all these bars is still going to be the same region that is at the top. The same as if we took the maximum of that region. The maximum of central on its own is just central. So we can either put the minimum or maximum in there in this view, and we're not worried about the results. Our calculation is valid. So let's click OK. Let's pick up our highlighter and drag it to color. And let's fix that none to a nice gray color. And there we have it. We've performed the task. We've highlighted the sales that are over 50,000 with the color of the region, and we've kept that neutral color in there. So we've got the start of a flow for fixing these cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate variables. So if you see that error, the start of your process should be, have you got any sums or averages or things that aggregate the data within that view? If you have, then your first thought should be, can I make everything in that view an aggregate? And if I can, then do it. In this case, we could move region to an aggregate, we could fix that error and move on. So let's start with the second example. In this example, I've got this parameter selector. And I'm looking at that selector changes the measure that's on my view. It's got two values, sales and profit. So if I select sales, it changes this measure in the axis on rows and changes the chart that we've got. So I've got sales at the moment, now I've got profit. I'd like to add profit ratio into this view. So let's do that. I'm using this measure select value. And you can see the way I've set this up. I've got a parameter. Let's come back out and show you the parameter. So I've got a parameter down here that just has two values, sales and profit, and that's a string parameter. So we can add in our profit ratio. So we do that, we're going to display it as the same thing, that makes sense. And so we're adding an item to that list that I had over on the right. That does nothing on its own. What we need to do is use this measure select calculation to select that. So the measure select calculation at the moment says, if selector equals sales, then return me sales. Else if the selector equals profit, so if I've selected profit in that parameter, then it's going to return profit. So I need to cope with that extra element within my new parameter. So if selector equals profit ratio, then return me the profit ratio. And I should be good because all these items, sales, profit, and profit ratio, don't have an average or a sum. So I've passed that first check in my flowchart. And selector is just a parameter, so that's not an aggregate either. Except I'm running into problems and I've got the same error. Cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate variables. But that flow told me I should be okay. I've got no averages and sums. And the reason being that my profit ratio is already an aggregate, as I defined before. So if I drag that up here, just pick it up and highlight it and drag it out of the window, then we can see that I've got AGG. So if you get this error and you're not sure which of your calculations are an aggregate, that's one way of fixing it. Just pick it up and drag it and see which comes up with AGG. The other thing you can do is, if I click on here and click on the actual calculation, on the right, it will give me that calculation text. And so I can see that there's some sums in here, sum of profit and sum of sales, that are doing that aggregation. So I know this is an aggregate. So this is an aggregate. Now everything else in my calculation needs to become an aggregate. So I need to define the aggregations for sales and profit. So in this case, I want to show the sum of sales. So we just wrap this one in sum, wrap this one in the sum of profit. My calculation is valid. So let's zoom out, click OK. We've got our error again that we had before. We know how to fix this. It's complaining that we've defined an aggregate. So we can pick up our new measure that's now an aggregate and replace it. And now our three different values work with that selector. So we fixed that error and the flow for doing that. We didn't see any sums this time. So we know that a calculation within that field must already be an aggregate. So therefore, we find it and we've applied exactly the same fix again. Example 3. I've got that similar chart. This time I'm not doing it on anything more complicated than sales by over order date. And I've got a subcategory here that just selects that filter. So that's a simple filter that just changes the subcategory that's displaying the time over. But I want to add a dynamic title for this chart. I want to let the user know how much sales they've made over time. Now, normally we'd add a title to a chart just by coming just here, coming to title, and we'd alter it. So we'd say the sales for, and then we'd come here. But we can't add the values within our view to the title in a view like this. Tableau doesn't give us the ability to add those values on the view into the custom titles. So I'm going to have to find a different way of doing that. And let's hide that title. The way of doing this is to use a separate sheet in Tableau. We're going to use a separate sheet with a text mark in order to build that. And I've got one just here. So we've got an empty sheet where we're going to start building out that title. So this has got the subcategory that I'm using filtered already. So we've made a start. And then I'm going to use this dynamic title. So remember, we want to tell the user what subcategory they've created. And we also want to tell them the total sales over time. So let's start. So we're going to tell them the subcategory that they've selected. And then we're going to use the plus symbol to concatenate that with some text. So subcategory has sales of, we're going to use another plus symbol to add on our sum of sales. And we've got an error. So we know what this error should be because we're using subcategory just here without an aggregation, and sum of sales just here, which is an aggregation. So we're fairly confident by flow 1, we know what we're going to see just here. Except we're not. We've got a slightly different error. Can't add string and float variables. And in Tableau, what that means is that when we use the plus symbol, it can mean two different things. If I want to do 1 plus 3, it's going to give me the answer 4, if they're numbers. If I'm using the plus symbol in the sense that I am here, then it's concatenating those text strings together. And because this is a number, and because this is a string, Tableau doesn't know what to do with either side of that value. Should it add the word has sum of sales and convert it to a number for us? Well, no, that's not what we want to do. We want to turn this side into a string. And we do that with the str function. And that converts that float number into a string that can then be added on. Now we're back to that error that we expected. We've got that cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate arguments with this function. So we know how to fix this. We've got a filter on subcategory in our view, so the logical thing would be to do what we did last time. Add the minimum of that subcategory. Because we're filtering to subcategory, then the minimum of the subcategory should be the same thing. So let's do that. Let's drag that to our text. Right. So we've got copiers has sales of 300. Well, that looks a bit ugly. We can fix that by using the round function. So we're going to come in here, round sum of sales to 0 before converting it to a string. Right. I could do with putting a currency symbol in there or something, making it a bit more usable to my users, but we've kind of got our text. So now when I come back into my dashboard, we've got that nice bit of text. I could perhaps make it a bit bigger that says copiers has sales of this. I'd format this and make it look a bit nicer, but you get the idea. Now, what happens when I select all on my filter? It now tells me that accessories has sales of nearly £2 million. That's not what I wanted to show. Accessories actually only has sales of 163,000. My filter now is with the all is causing my title to go wrong. Because I used this min. I used min, and Tableau is taking the minimum of all my subcategories that I've got selected in the filter, and it's returning me the smallest, which is the first alphabetically, which is accessories. So I need to do something else. One way around this is to use the Attr function. Hands up if you've used the Attr function before. Keep your hand up if you can explain how it works. Right, we've got one or two. I won't ask you to do it. The way I explain the way Attr works. So we've got this filter. So our subcategory filter. And at the moment, I've got accessories selected. Now, the minimum just here of that subcategory, because we've only got one selected, is accessories. The maximum of that subcategory is obviously still accessories. We've got one selected. And the Attr of that, this third value just here, is also accessories. Nice and straightforward. So what happens when I change that and add in a second value? Now, the minimum is accessories, because that's the first alphabetically. The maximum is appliances, because that's the last alphabetically. And our Attr is going to return as a star. The star just says, I couldn't resolve this value to a single value in Tableau. Therefore, I'm going to kind of just say, I don't know what to do with it, and I'm going to return a star, a blank, etc. So I tend to use Attr all the time when I'm fixing and trying to aggregate my values, because it's really easy, like in the first example where we use minimum, it's really easy to change that view and suddenly end up in a situation where you're taking the minimum accidentally, like we are in that title, and we don't spot it. So Attr will just cause that star, and you'll know that something's wrong. So let's do that. Let's come back to my title, and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger so you can see. There we go. So let's come back to my title and change this to Attr. And then we'll see what happens. So we've got those multiple selected in our view. So we've got multiple values like all. We get a blank showing. So Tableau's trying to add that star onto our string, and it goes blank, which is kind of okay. I'm happier than it telling me appliances had over 2 million sales, but it's not perfect. So let me show you the way that I fix this and stop that all having an effect. Oops. So the way I fix this is to test whether we have multiple values in our title, in our filter. So I say if the minimum of the subcategory is different to the maximum of the subcategory. Now, if they're equal, we know that we've only got one value. So we know that we can say then, else, and end. So we know that this portion is going to work when these two are equal, and we're in the second part of this. In fact, at this point, we could have used min, max, or Attr, and they'd all be the same. And then what I can say in this part, when we have got multiple values, is I can say the selected categories and I'm just going to copy and paste for speed. The selected categories have sales of that. So we've now got a valid calculation. We're testing to see if we have multiple values, and then we're changing our phrase in our title to do that. Else, we can pick out the subcategory and fix it. So now back to our dashboard. The selected categories have sales just here. Accessories has sales. So we've managed to fix that. Right, so in our flow, what does that mean? It means that, first of all, we check for any sums. If we've got them, then we try and add them. If we haven't, if we can't find them, we try and find them in the calculations, and then we fix things. If you can't use min or maximum because you've got multiple dimensions in a filter, then you can try using the if min is different to max to work around those special cases. Right, example 4. This is a fun one. It caught me out when I was building this presentation. And it left me confused for quite a few minutes as to why Tableau was acting like it was happening. So I learned something from building this presentation myself. So we're being asked to find sales that are all over 3 standard deviations from the average sale price. And we're trying to do that at the base row level, so that order level within our calculation, we're trying to find this. So let's start by dragging up onto rows. And I'm going to use the dimension here to pick out all those individual values of sales. I don't want to aggregate it. I just want to take the individual values. I'm going to turn that into a circle so that we can see it. And then I'm just going to jitter this because I just want to use the random function just to break that out. And again, I'm going to turn that into a dimension. All the random function is doing is just breaking that out so we can see all those individual values. And then let's just add a reference line to pick out the average. So that's just here. And then let's add another reference band or distribution to pick out any deviations in here. So let's start at 0.5 and minus 0.5. So you can see we're down kind of within this band down here. But I want 3 over. So let's just edit that reference line. So go with just a 3. So my 3 standard deviations are just here. And I'm trying to find all the outliers that are above that value. I'm just going to fix that so we can see it a little bit better. So we want a nice, let's turn it red. Right, so I'm trying to find all the values that are over 3 standard deviations out. So how do I do that? Let's calculate a field. This is number 4, outlier detection. So I'm going to be comparing the sales at the row level. So I'm saying, are my sales greater than the average sales plus 3 times the standard deviation of those sales to try and find those averages. And hopefully we've been doing this long enough together now to expect this error, because we've got sales just here, which is non-aggregate, and average sales and standard deviation sales, which are aggregate. So we need to fix that. Now, I'm trying to fix this at the row level. This sales has to be at the level of detail, at the row level of my calculation. That's why I'm trying to do this work. And so I can't change this to anything that aggregates it. That's the whole point of what I'm doing. Therefore, I need to change these 2 calculations to something that is at the row level. And the way I can do that is by using what's called a level of detail calculation in Tableau. You may have come across them. I'm going to use a really simple one, and I'll explain it a little bit. So I'm just going to put curly braces. So these curly type braces around here. And what that's going to do, those curly braces are going to tell Tableau to calculate that average sales across the whole data set. And then it's going to append that back as a row level to all of the rest of my data. So we calculate the average sales across everything, and then we attach it to every single row in our data set, which means that this becomes a row level calculation once it's in curly braces. So does this. My sales is already at the row level. Therefore, I've got a valid calculation. So now all that should remain to happen is I drop this on here and I color the pills and find those outliers. Except when I did this and was preparing the demo, I was suddenly shocked to find that this reference line wasn't where I expected it to be. The reference line is slightly above the values that I've got in here. And it took me quite a long time to work out, probably far too long, work out what was going on. And what's going on is that when we're using the dimension up here, Tableau is taking all those individual values and putting them in the average. But there might be 2 or 3 or 4 rows with the same sales value. Of course there's going to be. This is a big data set. And therefore, the average in our view is different to what I'm calculating in my calculation. And the best way to illustrate that perhaps is to just take some really simple data. So I've got six rows in Excel, and 5 of them have got the value 1, and 1 of them's got the value 10. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to come into Tableau, and I'm just going to paste it to get a new data set. So this is the way I often work through errors and try and work things out in my own head. I'll just create some dummy simple data in Tableau and then work it out. So let's clear that sheet. So we can look at our values in exactly the same way as I did, and we see we've got 2. And Tableau tells us down here in the bottom right-hand corner, 2 marks. So therefore, when I calculate the average just here and add that reference line, Tableau tells us that the average of our data is 5.5. It's not, because we've got multiple values. But what I was doing was using the dimension, which broke it. So we need to be really careful of this when we're looking at data and using dimensions to break out into what we think are the row level variables, but they're not. The dimension is an aggregated view of the individual values in that. It has no concept of how many values there are. How do we fix this? If we drag down the row ID onto detail, then you can see my average comes down to 2.5 like it should be. The row ID breaks this up. It breaks up the pane, the view we've got at a different level of detail, and we've got 6 marks now like we should have. So dragging that row ID onto here worked. And therefore we need to do the same when I come back to my example. We need to drag a primary key from our data that breaks down the data to the level we want to. In this case, there is a row ID hidden within Superstore Sales. You'll have to unhide your values, your columns, and make it available. But then if I drag this out and put it onto detail, the red line is where it should be and our orange values work. So in this case, it was the reference line that was wrong, not our calculation, but Tableau wasn't telling me what I expected to see. Right. Final example, example 5. Let's take this up a notch. We're being asked to look at sales risk across our subcategories. Now, sales risk is defined as individual sales, so going back to that row level, individual sales that have discounts at over 10%, or there's subcategories which have a profit ratio of under 10%. So i.e., they're subcategories that are at risk of being removed because they're not making us any profit across Europe. Or they're things that we're discounting very heavily at a sales because we might need to continue, we might stop discounting and the customer will stop buying from us. So let's put together what we've learned. We're going to build a product risk category, and that's going to define by the discount is greater than 0.1, or the profit ratio is less than 10%, so that's less than 0.1. And Tableau is going to tell us that, again, we cannot mix aggregate and non-aggregate arguments with this function. The reason it's doing that is because discount, as we know, is a row-level value. Profit ratio, we've done this a couple of times, is an aggregate. So we can't mix these two things. But again, our definition is that we need the discount to be at row level. That's how we've defined our calculation. And the profit ratio needs to be at an aggregate level. That's how we've defined the calculation. So we need to do something to fix this. And again, we'll come to level of detail calculations to solve that. Because what we need to do is calculate the profit ratio. So this is an example of our profit ratio at the subcategory level. This is the level we need it at. So for accessories, it's 0.2051. We need to attach that accessories level data to every row that has the accessories value. Same with the art, it needs to come down to here and be attached at the row level. And that's what level of details calculations do for us. I used a really simple one earlier, which was the two curly braces that calculated it at the entire values across our data set. But I need to do something at the subcategory level. So how do I do that? I need to run, still using the curly braces, I need to use the fixed keyword and fix my calculation, fix my aggregation to be at the subcategory level, i.e. this area just here. And that's going to turn it into a row level calculation. It's going to attach it to each of the rows in my data, and then I'm going to be able to use it like any other row level calculation and mix it up with those without getting this error message. So let's come back. Come up to our broken calculation. And let's type that in. So we're going to use fixed at the subcategory level, colon, profit ratio, close our curly brace. Our calculation is happy because this is non-aggregate now, it's at the row level, and this is non-aggregate. So now we can pick this up, drag on our profit risk. So the orange values are our sales that are at risk. And the beauty of this is that we're no longer limited to looking at this at the subcategory level. We could drag in something like country and see which countries are at risk from these sales. We're still calculating that product risk at the profit ratio level, but it's doing that and it's giving us the values for country. Whatever dimension we drag in, we can now work. So you can see that there's quite a few countries here with a big profit ratio. Let me just finish off our flow. So our final flow looks something like this. If you see that error, you first check, are there any sums or averages? If there are, then fix them. If you can't fix them because you've got multiple dimensions in the view, then you use your if min is different to max to fix special cases. And if you can't find any, then you make sure that any fields you're using are an aggregate. If you really need to mix it, you're like, Tableau, I really need to do this. Then you used a fixed LOD to get around that and move everything back to the row level. So this is kind of my super workflow for fixing these aggregate and non-aggregate values. There's one extra problem that I think people run into with fixed LODs. So let's go back to our view. Let's move it back to subcategory level. And let's drag on the profit ratio. In fact, let's leave that there. Right. So what happens is that people will say, let's filter. And let's filter to Belgium. And what we'll see is that the storage is highlighted as being completely at risk. Chairs are highlighted at being completely at risk, as are tables and machines. But if I drag on my profit ratio, you can see that my profit ratio of this isn't under 10%. My profit ratio of storage is well over the 10% threshold that we've set. So something's going wrong in our calculation now. What's happening to this profit ratio where this calculation is now wrong? this is broken. And the reason for that is that any filters you put into the filters area, when you're using a fixed level of detail calculation, automatically happen after the fixed level of details happened. So our fixed level of detail calculates that subcategory, profit ratio, and feeds it into our calculation. Then we filter out the sales. And that means that we're giving our viewers the wrong information. And that's happening because of the order of operations in Tableau. And this is something that as you become more advanced in Tableau, you need to be aware of. So dimension filters, which is the filter I'm using to filter Belgium, happens after the fixed calculation happens. So we need to use something that happens before. And in this case, I'm going to use a context filter. So context filters are relatively simple to implement. They move things up the order of operations. So we'll come back in here. To implement a context filter, we just need to add our filter to context, and now we get the right values. So anytime you're using a fixed LOD, you need to check what filters you're using in your dashboards and worksheets, and just make sure that they're on context if you intend them to happen at the same level of detail as the rest of your view. Right, let's recap. I've just shown you a process flow of how I fix level of detail calculations. That's not actually how I fix level of detail calculations. That's the process flow I use to illustrate it. And if you're the kind of person who, like me, likes to build and likes to experiment and build, don't follow the process flow. That process flow is there to illustrate how it works. If you do like structure, then by all means follow it and use that with your learning. But Tableau isn't a process. You don't follow things and work things out. I'd say practice. Do Makeover Monday, do Workout Wednesday, which are both Twitter projects that you can learn from. Get to know your data. Get to know your data inside out and know what a row level is, because that will help you solve these problems as they come up. Know Tableau. Through practice, if you learn Tableau, get to know what Tableau's doing, work out why it has those red errors, work out why it's broken, then you need to know your definitions. You need to know your aggregates, your non-aggregates. Practice, like I say, practice speaking to your colleagues and training them. The more you practice and speak to your colleagues about this, the more you'll learn about what you don't know. You might think you come away from this session knowing a bit more. I hope you do. But if you try and explain it to someone, suddenly your learning will go a bit further down. Then you can learn it and come back up again. So I've learned this through training other people. So yeah, tell your friends. And also ask your friends. So the Tableau community is absolutely fantastic. Just go to the Tableau community. There's loads on there. And if you come up here, so it's on tableau.com.community, the forums and user groups. I've got no internet. Of course I have. The forums and user groups will help you out. You can post your questions there and you'll get detailed answers on this level of problem. So any kind of calculation errors you can build out. I'm going to publish this to my Tableau public profile. So that's Chris Love on Tableau public. So go there, download it, work through the problems that I've got. We're about 3 minutes from time, so I won't take questions from the microphone, but if you want to come up and chat to me, have a chat through your errors, then I'll be here afterwards, but I'll also be at the Information Lab booth in the Sponsors Hall afterwards. So thank you very much for attending and have a great rest of conference.